Have you ever met someone who built walls so high, so strong that no one could break through? They tell themselves they don't need love, they don't need closeness, they don't need anyone. But here's the truth. Even the most avoidant person carries a secret fantasy so powerful, it makes them break every single rule they've set for themselves. And when that fantasy shows up, they can't resist. When it comes to avoidant personalities, the first thing people often notice is how hard they work to stay distant. They guard their hearts as if letting anyone in would cost them their very survival. On the surface, they appear self-sufficient, independent, and even cold. But beneath those layers is something they rarely admit to themselves: the powerful fantasy of being truly understood. This isn't about shallow validation or someone nodding along to their stories. It's about that deeper recognition, the kind where another person sees through the mask, past the rules, and into the raw humanity underneath. For an avoidant, this kind of understanding feels almost mythical, but when it shows up, it disarms them completely. An avoidant spends so much of their life convinced that no one will ever really get them. They believe that others will only judge, misinterpret, or dismiss their inner world. Because of that, they withdraw, they speak less, share less, and build a fortress of silence around themselves. They create rules: don't talk about feelings, don't get attached, don't let anyone close. Yet even with those rules, their soul quietly aches for someone who sees the truth without them having to explain. When they encounter a person who listens without interrupting, who notices the subtle details others ignore, who accepts their contradictions without demanding immediate change, that fantasy starts to come alive. It's as if a voice inside them whispers, "Finally, someone understands." And the very rules that were designed to keep people out begin to weaken. The power of being understood is not in grand gestures, but in the small moments. An avoidant may say something in passing, and the other person doesn't just hear the words, but senses the meaning beneath them. They may notice how silence isn't emptiness, but a language in itself. When this happens, the avoidant feels seen in a way that pierces through their usual defenses. Suddenly, sharing a piece of themselves doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like relief. They start to open up conversations that go deeper than surface-level talk, not because they plan to, but because the desire to be understood overpowers the need to protect. This fantasy is so strong because it touches the oldest wound in their story. Most avoidants carry experiences of feeling unseen or invalidated in their past. Maybe as children, their feelings were ignored, or their needs were too much for the people around them. So they learned to hide, to act like they didn't need anyone. But inside, the longing to be fully known never left. It only buried itself deeper. When someone comes along and creates an atmosphere where they feel safe enough to be real, it is like water to a desert. The avoidant may still resist at first, but the pull is undeniable. They will break their own rule of silence. They will let themselves linger in the company of that person, and they will reveal fragments of their soul they swore to keep hidden. This is why the fantasy of being truly understood makes avoidants break the rules they live by. It's not because they suddenly stop being afraid. It's because the joy of being known outweighs the fear of being hurt. The idea that someone could love them not for the image they present, but for the truth they conceal, is more intoxicating than any defense they've built. In that moment, the avoidant no longer wants to run. They want to stay, they want to share, and they want to experience what they've craved all along, to be seen for who they are and still be accepted. And when that fantasy begins to feel real, every wall, every rule, and every fear starts to crumble. For the avoidant, intimacy has always been a double-edged sword. On one hand, it is something they secretly long for, a closeness that feels nurturing and safe. On the other hand, it is the very thing they fear most, because intimacy to them has always meant suffocation, loss of independence, or eventual betrayal. This is why they build rules to keep their distance, rules about not getting too close, not relying on anyone, and not staying vulnerable for too long. Yet despite all of these protective strategies, there exists a fantasy so strong that it pulls them out of hiding, the fantasy of safe intimacy. Safe intimacy is not about constant togetherness or grand displays of affection. For an avoidant, it is about experiencing closeness without the threat of being controlled or engulfed. Their fear is not love itself. It is the idea that love will cost them their freedom. They imagine that if they allow someone too close, they will lose themselves. But within the heart of every avoidant lies the dream of a connection where they can be deeply known and deeply loved without feeling trapped. They want a bond where silence is respected, where space is not mistaken for disinterest, and where affection does not own with strings attached. When an avoidant encounters a relationship that offers this kind of safety, something begins to shift. The rules they once swore by start to feel less necessary. Instead of pulling away when someone gets too close, they lean in, curious about how it feels to stay without fear. When intimacy is handled with patience and gentleness, the avoidant learns that closeness does not have to mean losing autonomy. It can mean having a partner who stands beside them rather than over them. This realization is life-changing because it challenges the very foundation of their avoidance. Safe intimacy for them is the kind where their boundaries are respected without question. They may test this at first, pulling back to see if the other person chases or pressures them. But when they realize that their space is honored and the bond remains intact, even when they step away, the avoidant begins to trust. Trust is rare for them, and when it forms, their walls naturally weaken. They start to let themselves be more affectionate, more vulnerable, and more emotionally present, even though their rules once told them not to. The fantasy of intimacy without fear is so powerful that it overrides the instinct to run. This longing often traces back to early experiences where intimacy felt unsafe. Perhaps they grew up in an environment where closeness came with conditions, where affection was withdrawn as punishment, or where love was suffocating instead of freeing. So they learned to survive by keeping distance. Yet the soul never forgets what it longs for. Even the most avoidant heart carries the dream of safe closeness, a love that heals rather than harms. When they find someone who embodies this, it feels like discovering something they thought did not exist. The transformation is not immediate. Avoidants do not suddenly become open books just because they meet someone who feels safe. But the process begins with small acts, staying longer in a conversation, letting a hand linger instead of pulling away, reaching out first instead of waiting for the other. These moments may seem small, but for them, they are revolutionary. Each one represents a broken rule, a step away from fear, and a step toward intimacy. What makes this fantasy so powerful is that it resolves their deepest contradiction. They crave love, but fear its cost. They want intimacy, but dread losing independence. Safe intimacy promises both, a bond where they are free and yet connected. When an avoidant tastes this possibility, their defenses no longer feel protective, they feel restrictive, and so they allow themselves to break their own rules because the reward of safe intimacy is far greater than the comfort of isolation. For the avoidant, the idea of unconditional love feels almost impossible. They have lived much of their life believing that love always comes with conditions, expectations, or hidden costs. They have told themselves that if people truly saw who they were, with all their flaws and insecurities, they would be rejected or abandoned. That fear is the foundation of the rules they build. Don't show too much emotion. Don't depend on anyone. Don't let anyone too close. These rules give them a sense of control and safety, but they also keep them from experiencing the one thing they long for most. Deep in their heart, they carry the fantasy of unconditional love, the dream that someone could stay, not because of what they provide, not because of who they pretend to be, but simply because of who they are. This fantasy is so powerful because it speaks directly to the wound that drives their avoidance. Many avoidants grew up in environments where love felt conditional. Perhaps they were loved only when they performed well, stayed quiet, or behaved in ways that pleased others. Or maybe they were shamed, dismissed, or abandoned when they expressed their real feelings. Over time, they internalized the belief that love had to be earned, that they were not enough just as they were. To protect themselves, they stopped relying on others, convinced that no one would truly love them if they saw their whole self. Yet the longing for unconditional acceptance never went away, it only went underground. When an avoidant meets someone who offers love without conditions, their entire inner system is challenged. Imagine a partner who does not withdraw when they become distant, who does not demand constant proof of affection, who does not punish them for being imperfect. Imagine someone who can hold space for their silence, for their contradictions, and for their slow pace of opening up. This kind of love feels foreign but deeply magnetic. It speaks to the hidden part of them that has always wished for this kind of acceptance. Even though their rules tell them to resist, to question, and to pull back, the fantasy of being loved unconditionally pulls them forward. The avoidant may test this love at first. They might withdraw to see if the person will chase or abandon them. They might show their less polished sides to see if love will still be offered. And when that acceptance remains steady, when love does not vanish in the face of imperfection, something extraordinary begins to happen. The avoidant's belief that they must always perform or hide begins to weaken. They allow themselves to share pieces of their true self, thoughts they never voice, emotions they usually suppress, fears they usually bury. Every time they are met with acceptance instead of rejection, the fantasy starts to feel like reality. Unconditional love has the power to dismantle the avoidance rules because it addresses their deepest fear, the fear of not being enough. When that fear is answered with consistency and care, the old rules no longer feel protective, they feel unnecessary. The avoidant starts to realize that closeness does not have to mean judgment, vulnerability does not have to mean loss, love does not have to mean control. For perhaps the first time, they taste the freedom of being loved without conditions, and that freedom is more intoxicating than isolation. This is why the fantasy of unconditional love makes avoidants break the very rules they set. It allows them to risk showing up fully, to let themselves be held, to step into intimacy without the constant fear of rejection. It teaches them that they can be seen in their rawest form and still be valued. Once they experience that, they can no longer live comfortably behind walls, because the possibility of love without fear is far too beautiful to turn away from. Avoidants often live with the belief that they must choose between love and freedom, that having one automatically means losing the other. In their world, relationships feel like cages, and closeness feels like a slow erosion of self. They convince themselves that the only way to protect their independence is to stay detached, to keep rules that prevent anyone from getting too close. This is why they say things like, "I'm not ready for a relationship," or "I just need space." These statements are not lies, they are shields. They are defenses against the terror of being swallowed whole by another person's expectations. But underneath those defenses lies a fantasy they rarely admit, the dream of a relationship where they do not have to sacrifice their freedom to experience connection. They long for a love that does not take away their independence but strengthens it. This fantasy is so compelling because it offers what they thought could never exist: balance. To them, past experiences have often equated intimacy with control. Perhaps they once felt smothered by a partner who demanded constant attention, or they grew up in a home where personal boundaries were never respected. Over time, they learned to associate love with suffocation, and so they built rules to preserve their sense of self. Don't get too close, don't rely on anyone, don't stay long enough to be trapped. Yet even while living by these rules, the human heart inside them has always wanted both, to be free and to be deeply connected. When an avoidant meets someone who embodies this balance, it shifts everything. Imagine being with a partner who allows space without resentment, who does not interpret distance as rejection, and who celebrates individuality rather than fearing it. Suddenly, the avoidant begins to see that love does not have to equal loss of autonomy. They discover that they can share a life without giving up their own. This realization is powerful enough to make them challenge their own defenses. They start to take risks they once avoided, like opening up about feelings, making future plans, or prioritizing the relationship, not because they suddenly stopped valuing independence, but because they realized that true connection does not threaten it. At first, this balance can feel too good to be true. The avoidant might test it by withdrawing to see if the other person becomes clingy or demanding. They might assert boundaries to check if those limits will be respected. And when they find that the bond remains steady, that their freedom is not under attack, they begin to relax into the relationship. It is in this relaxation that their rules start to crumble. They no longer feel the need to run at the first sign of closeness, because closeness no longer feels like suffocation. Instead, it feels like support, like companionship that enhances their individuality instead of erasing it. The fantasy of freedom and connection is so powerful because it dissolves the avoidant's greatest contradiction. Their rules were built on the belief that freedom and love cannot coexist. When that belief is proven wrong, when they experience a relationship that honors both, they have no reason to cling to those rules anymore. For the first time, love feels like an expansion rather than a confinement. They can be themselves fully, pursue their own passions, and still belong to someone deeply. The walls they built around their heart no longer serve a purpose because the very thing they feared, losing themselves, turns out not to be part of the equation. This is why avoidants, when faced with the fantasy of freedom and connection becoming real, break the boundaries they once held sacred. They begin to commit in ways they swore they never would, not out of obligation but out of choice. They start to let someone in, not because they must, but because they want to. And in that space where freedom and intimacy meet, the avoidant experiences a love that feels natural, safe, and worth every risk. At the deepest level, every avoidant carries a hidden longing for a connection that feels almost otherworldly, a bond so powerful it transcends the surface rules they've lived by. This is not about casual attraction or fleeting interest. It is about a soul-level bond, the kind of connection that makes them feel as though they are seen, known, and linked to another person in a way that cannot be explained logically. For someone who has spent much of their life running from closeness, this fantasy is both terrifying and irresistible. The avoidant tells themselves that love is dangerous, that vulnerability will lead to pain, yet the dream of a bond that feels destined, magnetic, and unbreakable sits quietly inside them, waiting for the right moment to rise to the surface. The idea of a soul-level bond is different from ordinary intimacy. It's not about constant attention or dramatic declarations. For the avoidant, it shows up in subtle but powerful ways. It might be the sense that this person understands them without words, or the feeling that being with them doesn't require performance or pretense. It's the quiet recognition that they can sit in silence with someone and still feel connected, that their presence alone is enough. This is the kind of connection the avoidant secretly craves, because it cuts through the noise of their fears and goes straight to the essence of who they are. It is not about breaking down their walls by force, but about gently dissolving them through a depth of connection that feels undeniable. When avoidants encounter this kind of bond, they often resist it at first. They may withdraw, distance themselves, or try to convince themselves it's not real. Their rules demand that they stay safe, keep space, and never let anyone too close. But the pull of a soul-level bond is stronger than those rules. It makes them question everything they thought they knew about relationships. They start to notice that no matter how far they pull back, they are still drawn to this person. No matter how hard they try to rationalize their feelings, they cannot shake the sense that something rare and profound is unfolding. This is the point where their rules begin to lose their power, not because they want them to, but because the connection is too strong to deny. The fantasy of a soul bond often stems from their earliest unmet needs. Many avoidants felt disconnected or unseen in childhood, as though no one truly recognized their inner world. They learned to survive by hiding parts of themselves, by pretending not to care, by building independence at the expense of connection. But deep down, they have always wanted someone who could reach them at that hidden level, who could see the self they keep locked away. When they find a person who awakens that sense of being known beyond words, it feels like discovering a missing piece of their soul. And in that moment, the rules that once kept them safe begin to feel like chains, keeping them from what they desire most. This kind of bond inspires transformation. The avoidant begins to take risks they never imagined taking. They reveal parts of themselves they swore they would never share. They allow themselves to feel emotions they usually bury. The walls they built over years start to crumble, not because they want to lose control, but because the bond feels worth the vulnerability. The dream of finding someone who sees their soul and still chooses them is stronger than any defense mechanism. It breaks their rules gently but powerfully, replacing fear with longing and resistance with surrender. At its core, the fantasy of a soul-level bond represents the avoidant's deepest hope, that they can be fully known and still fully loved. When that fantasy begins to come true, everything changes. Their rules, their distance, their silence all give way to the undeniable truth that connection is not their enemy. It is their greatest desire. And once they allow themselves to step into that bond, they discover a love so profound, it reshapes the way they see themselves, their partner, and the very meaning of intimacy. At the end of the day, avoidants are not cold, heartless, or incapable of love. They are simply people who learn to survive by protecting themselves from pain. But deep within, there is always a longing that no rule, no wall, no distance can silence. The fantasy of being understood, of safe intimacy, of unconditional love, of freedom with connection, and of a soul-level bond. These are not just dreams. They are the keys to breaking through the avoidance defenses. And when these fantasies are touched, when they start to feel real, the avoidant begins to change. They break their own rules, not because someone forced them, but because love finally feels safer than fear. That is the moment when the avoidant stops running and starts staying. That is when walls crumble and vulnerability becomes strength. So if you have ever wondered whether avoidants can truly love, the answer is yes. They can love with a depth most people cannot imagine when they find the connection that speaks to their soul. And once they taste that, no rule can ever hold them back again.